the question that I wanted to start off with is the question about a phrase that you use in your research, in your papers, and that is the politics of psychology. That's something that I have to say, I have to admit, when I read that's the very first, I regard myself as someone who is well read on politics. I'm even a practitioner of politics, but the politics of psychology, I try to figure out exactly what that means.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Okay, khair, inshallah. So I think the politics of psychology lends itself to various different traditions of critique, not necessarily only of social sciences, but also of medicine, as it relates to statecraft. To think that any field, be it psychiatry, be it sociology, be it psychology, or apolitical, is in fact often reinforcing status quo thinking of what these disciplines are doing in practice. So there's a long history of thinking already critically of psychology, how it developed as a field. And it's important here to emphasize that psychology and psychiatry, what I'll call the side disciplines, have very contentious histories. They have very uncertain histories, where they come from, and also how they came to be in terms of the relationship to statecraft, to questions of managing populations, understanding what is wellness, what is illness, how do we define what it is, where it comes from. So there's a lot of different trajectories we can approach that from. There's obviously, we can think about its Eurocentrism and how psychology is related, let's say, to, very obvious notions of capitalism and issues of mental health being related to productivity. And often, questions of people feeling like they're no longer productive is one way of sort of recognizing that there's something wrong in terms of their well-being. And so I think that's often probably the most recognizable critique of the side disciplines. But I think there's we are beginning, right? I wasn't sure. Okay, sorry about that. So, yeah, there's one element I think is very important to Muslims. And here we could draw on a trajectory of how it relates to marginalized populations. So the side disciplines have very well-documented histories in terms of colonial projects and the way they were implemented in terms of surveillance and the management of colonized populations. That's well known. What's also well known is how these side disciplines were also implemented, let's say during the civil rights era. There is a political utility to diagnosis. Besides what we think is this very benevolent purpose of trying to help people, there's always a political utility. One political utility to diagnosis, especially during the civil rights movement, when many in the Black community wanted to arm themselves to protect themselves. A diagnosis was used to be able to prevent people from being able to purchase a weapon. There's obviously discussions about Soviet Union and the way political dissent was pathologized. And I draw on these different histories to understand how that's particular for us, for Muslims in the moment. And so I think these are best illustrated with examples. The one example I give here, for example, is there's a prevent policy. And for people who don't know, prevent is a policy in which people, or in which public bodies have a duty to identify and report individuals they suspect might have some sort of, what they call it, pre-crime, some sort of tendency or vulnerability to become radicalized.
Is that according to Prevent, or the authorities in Prevent, is that something that is within the DNA, or is that something that has been planted during the course of this person's education or upbringing or whatever?
Yeah. So you mean the way Prevent might frame radicalization?
Why would they think that a certain person has the tendency of, or that kind of pre-crime analysis that person might be someone whom they want to take interest in?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. So certainly there's an element of racism that has to be flagged here. It's not very different to trying to understand why in London, through stop and search policies, police are much more likely to stop and search 30 times more likely, actually, in fact, to stop and search a black youth vis-a-vis a white youth, right? So when we're asking ourselves, what are sort of the indications that someone has that might make them susceptible to being viewed as a potential threat in the future, there's a point where it doesn't matter what someone says or does, their very bodies alone will speak something. There's some sort of symbolic value to their bodies.
Is this somehow related to profiling?
Yes, absolutely.
It is.
It is profiling.
It is profiling.
It is 100% profiling. But I think it also belongs, this idea of profiling, I think sometimes can be used as thinking of it as a form of strategy. But I don't think this is a strategy that's encoded explicitly, right? It's the same way that police aren't told, go look out for black youth, right? Yeah. It's the fact that the very association between blackness and violence is something that is prevalent in public consciousness. And that same sort of affiliation, or what I call racialization, Muslims are racialized in different ways. But obviously, one of the main points of racialization in the war on terror is that Muslims are racialized as threat or as potential risks within a logic of national security. And so that's why people who aren't even Muslims, that's how we know someone who might be Sikh. We've seen this in movies. There's a movie called Inside Man in which a Sikh person has his turban removed and considered a terrorist. These sort of these are sort of things that respond back to that question. If the person themselves, if they identify as Muslim, is even relevant or not to the process of racialization, and that's a simple answer, no, right? So even for Prevent, it actually becomes irrelevant. And I have one case example. I haven't unpacked it in my research because I'm only allowed to sort of share the tidbit itself. And the tidbit is, there was one person in the NHS that was referred through Prevent because they came from Syria, but they weren't even Muslim.
Wow.
So a Prevent referral was made of them, given the sort of racialization of, as Arab, they were Christian. And it speaks volumes to how complicated this process of racialization actually.
So if we were, I mean, it's fascinating because there are so many layers that you could discuss, and there are so many questions. I mean, almost every single sentence you spoke there brings up an array of questions. But the question that really, is prevalent right now in my mind is, leave aside, let's say, the ill effects, we're going to come to those, of profiling, of Prevent tactics and the such. How successful, I mean, what are we talking about in terms of success rates of this particular method? I mean, does it work?
Yeah.
Because, I mean, regardless, we'll talk about the efficacy, we'll talk about, good or bad later on. We'll discuss this. We might have already come to a judgment regarding whether it's good or bad. But the question is, does it work?
That's a great question. And probably the best place to begin, Prevent is notoriously known to not work. This is not something that's coming from me. The recent review of Prevent, Shawcross, made the same observation.
Right? I agree.
And so there's a point in which Prevent, Shawcross's argument comes from a place that's very problematic. His point is that Prevent is clearly becoming one of it's losing its central focus on Muslims, and its efficacy would increase if it focused on Muslims more, and if it managed also Islam more directly. So he's looking towards France, he's looking towards other countries, and he's recommending that we emulate them. Prevent has been a failure on many different levels besides its racism, but one can also very clearly see in many of the attacks, people who were previously referred to Prevent, its idea of de-radicalization is ad hoc. Its way of funding is completely ad hoc. So it's been something, the way when I teach on it, I make that distinction between evidence-based policy and politics-based evidence.
Right.
And Prevent is a very clear example, and this idea doesn't come from Prevent. So people have discussed this in relation to other sort of policies, whereby there was a sort of movement from above. Someone decided we need to have this policy. There's no evidence for it, right? Actually, as I've argued previous to this, there was already evidence to show that Muslims were very good at self-policing. Muslims were very good at, when they recognize an issue in the community, they would develop that sort of, that awareness.
Yeah. And the mechanism of addressing that.
Exactly.
problem.
It was something that was already well established. What the process of securitization, what I call something like Prevent, what it actually in fact does is that it completely destabilizes, and in fact it perverts the central element, which is trust. For any system to actually function, it has to require that trust. Otherwise, it's one that's based on surveillance and risk logics, in which we can never trust each other. So we have to know as much we need to know as much of each other as possible, right? And so it certainly hasn't worked on many different levels. And I think, unfortunately, I think I would like to emphasize that I think one of the biggest problems with Prevent, why it hasn't worked, is that it took a colorblind approach eventually because of its accusations of racism and Islamophobia. If you recall that example, I said that police aren't told to go out and look for black youth. Prevent, in effect, tried to become colorblind, but not in its own essence addressing why counterterrorism policies and strategies, when they're embedded within public bodies, become racist in impact. And so, I think this may be a long-winded answer to how it's going to relate to psychology, but I can still get to that if you watch.
It's extremely fascinating, particularly your take on mental health and how that has quite an impact on counterterrorism strategies, on approaches and methods and the such.
Yeah.
And this is something that we don't think of. From my end at least. I deal with the hows and the whys and the outcomes. But you're going into something which is quite profound. Yeah. You're going into the DNA of the decision-making process. And that is something which is, on one hand, quite impressive, but on another, it's quite worrying as well. Because it's something that most people don't understand. What is the relationship between this approach to trying to suss out potential? We've seen films whereby, the hero looks into the future and predicts a crime and stops it before it is committed.
Tom Cruise, not just any hero.
Tom Cruise, yes, absolutely right. My apologies. But we are virtually there. This is what we're talking about, aren't we? We're talking about the authorities who have the capacity, who have the jurisdiction, pointing out who it is that might commit a crime which is seen as within the realms of terrorism or the such.
Yeah.
This is crazy.
It is. I think it just goes to show how much policies itself are implicated within these broader movements and associations I call it from above, right? From those in power. We think about neoconservative think tanks like the Henry Jackson Society and others. And I think people tend to think that politics is this sort of fluid democratic process, which is certainly no longer the case. I think the public, I don't think anyone believes that anymore. But I think there's also an implication for me personally, I think for many Muslims who enter into higher education or education in general, for them to think that medicine as a field is apolitical or that healthcare is an apolitical space. That's often been my biggest contention, especially among Muslims. There's still a great sort of support and push for Muslims to, what I guess what we believe will be some form of change in maybe Islamophobia if more and more Muslims achieve the sort of social mobility, they call it, right? We achieve this middle class status. We become more doctors, more engineers. So I already have a problem with that strategy, but I think from within this idea that these are all sort of apolitical fields, especially healthcare, I think has been a big blind spot for us. I mean, there's a lot of rich traditions in sociology of healthcare, understandings of illness, and these things have been written about in volumes and volumes, and it's not something that we've really been able to articulate for ourselves why that's important. And I think it's more and more important, in fact. Prevent is actually a good example of that because Prevent is highly psychologized.
Yeah.
And it speaks to people who are emotionally vulnerable. In my book, I give the example of Khalid, who had this deep love and desire for the people of Syria. And he wanted to help them. So I think he made some sort of transfer of money over there to help. And then that was like potentially accused of potential terrorism. That case dropped. So the whole terrorism charge against him dropped. But he still had a probation officer. And the probation officer, and this is really important in the report, the probation officer felt that because Khalid still has these strong emotions towards what's happening towards other people in Syria, that he's potentially almost always at risk of radicalization. And so you can see here how certain emotions are pathologized of certain people, but that pathology, because they are those people, is also directly securitized.
Yeah.
We've seen this also for Palestine. People, we know there's these, in schools, students who might act out.
Yes.
There's a lot of racism already written in sort of the fine print of how certain kids are seen as acting out while other kids might be expressing their opinions, etc. But we know of examples in which people might have very legitimate forms of distress, experience of the distress. Yeah. But because that's not recognized as a legitimate form of distress, what ends up happening is pathologized. So I'll give a really important example that I like to emphasize. I have to explain one thing before that. One of the underground or undercover developments that happen through Prevent are things called mental health hubs. Mental health hubs were initially being rolled out as trials it's an unprecedented relationship between police and healthcare. So it's co-funded by police and NHS. And they were doing trials in the south and Midlands and in the north of England. And basically anyone who's being referred to for Prevent or anyone who was deemed, remember, there's a racism embedded in those referrals, was receiving a mental health assessment.
Okay.
So that's really important. So let's take now 1,000 people, 1,000 youth. And the reason why I say 1,000 youth is because we, and by we I mean Hill Aked of MedAct, FOI did a Freedom of Information request and got the police reports. And so we're now reading the police reports and we find that most of the referrals to these mental health hubs are young Asian youth, right? So let's say 16, around the age of 16, 1,000 of them are referred. And now we don't know why they're being referred. They've been seen as potentially at risk of radicalization and terrorism. Now, mental health assessments are being done of them, which has its own sort of ethical questions. But the police are now sitting with all this data, and they're looking at the mental health assessments of all these youth, and so you have this graph with all these bars, and so you'll see that there's high levels of, let's say there's medium levels of trauma, but there's high levels of emotional and behavioral dysfunction, and there's low levels of psychosis, and there's very low levels of distress. And this is something that I unpack because what's very significant here is this relationship between emotional and behavioral dysfunction as a way of categorizing someone who's acting out. Let's say a youth who's very angry and upset. Something is touching them about what they're seeing in the world. Yeah. And it matters to them, maybe not in a logic that might matter to the teacher. Maybe the teacher is thinking very locally. The youth is thinking maybe globally in a way that the teacher is asking themselves, well, why are you so angry and upset about what's happening on the other side of the world? The police themselves, whoever wrote that report, makes such a revealing remark. They themselves note that they say, it's very fascinating that the stress is so low. It seems that bar of distress was very low. It seems that potentially what's happening is that people who are distressed are being pathologized. They're being given a diagnosis in another category. I think emotional dysfunction is a good example, right? What's the difference between someone who's angry about a legitimate cause and someone who's angry because their cause is illegitimate? And here we see the politics of psychology, what it's able to do. Psychology has a very powerful depoliticizing impulse. When I see you and you're angry, and I say, Dr. Anas has a problem with anger, has a personal problem with anger, it's a way of individualizing that towards you, depoliticizing it from your circumstances, and making it a question of your own rehabilitation, rather than making it a question of, well, maybe you're in a situation where you have a right, and that anger is a form of expression. It's legitimate, and it's pointing towards a wider context. And so I think this is something that we, as well in the community, we fall into that very quickly. I think it's important, especially for Muslims, to have, I know there's many who kind of espouse and are trying to promote mental health framework. And I'm very happy and I'm very encouraging of this, but I think we need to understand and temper what all of this means. And we can't think that just simply having this sort of benevolent view that if everyone had a psychiatrist or a psychologist in the Muslim community, everything would be okay. Quite the contrary. What we're seeing is that, in fact, it might very well lead to a place where we're policing ourselves through a different language.
So in a way, we're talking about something that's been problematized. It's not necessarily a problem per se, because many of the reactions you spoke about are quite normal reactions. I mean, you'd expect those reactions. In fact, on many occasions, you'd assume that the absence of those reactions is in itself telling and problematic.
Yes.
So the issue is problematizing something which is quite inherently normal and within the intrinsic behavior of normal human beings. But yet the impact is so quite significant. It's so dramatic. I mean, I was involved in a case in a local primary school where one of the children was drawing a map of Palestine. And all of a sudden, this became an issue. The parents were called in. The social carer was called in. The head teacher was one step away from calling the police.
Yeah.
And all of this because during lessons, the child, who was around 8 years old, drew a map of Palestine.
Yeah.
And yes, during that time, Palestine was all over the news. Yes, his parents were watching things unfold in Palestine, hour after hour. But the way in which now we're presenting these cases as anomalies is in itself quite problematic. And the thing is that, I mean, what you're talking about is something which is extremely complex, extremely sophisticated, and beyond the realms of understanding of the vast majority. I would include the parents. They wouldn't understand all of this, especially if it was given to them in the same kind of vernacular. So they would be unable to respond intelligently or legibly to why it is that their child, for instance, is driven to draw a map of Palestine. But the issue of mental health, I'd like to touch on this a little bit, because one of the quite deeply seated convictions of many within the Muslim community is that any act that is committed by a Muslim is seen as a criminal act. When a non-Muslim commits probably the same or even a more, expansive attack or the such, it's always down to mental health. It's always down to mental health. Now, I'm not sure whether statistics, whether they add up and they prove that that is correct. I do know that on many occasions I've read about an attack on, for instance, a church attended by African Americans, by someone who has clearly spoken of racist beliefs and convictions, and many people are killed, and yet the word terrorism is nowhere to be found within that kind of description. The attacks by certain supporters of a particular president mowing down protesters in an American city, for instance, that is nowhere near, terrorism, for instance. It's always down to mental health. It's always down to the fact that these people, they were abused when they were little. They were exposed to one thing or another. And yes, it does draw up frustration. But the fact is, I would, once again, going back, leaving aside all politics, leaving aside all our prejudices, many created as a result of the past, 10, 20 years that we've been living through. But I would suggest that any crime committed is a manifestation of some sort of mental health. And when it's driven, let's say, by political reasons or the such, then it has its own, categorization of mental health issues that have driven this person to harm others for something that won't be achieved through this means. I mean, ultimately, you're pursuing something that won't be achieved through this means. If anything, it's the reverse that will be had. I don't know whether I'm making my point clear, but
you are.
But the point of mental health is something that we're now coming to grips with. It seems that authorities, and particularly within the counter-terrorism sphere, have been far way ahead of the game in terms of, trying to outline exactly what this has and how it carries and the such. And we're only now coming to grips with all of this. And therefore, whenever giving advice to parents who might be hauled before head teachers and social workers and the such, because their child spoke something or said something or expressed something or drew something, how do they respond to this?
So I think you raised several really important points.
Yes, several.
And I'm going to try to take them in the order that you said them. But I think overall, there's something to be said about why Muslims are being impacted that way, let's say through counterterrorism. I think there's something very important here. And the second point I think we'll talk about is mental health the solution to this, right?
Okay.
So as for the first, I think this has been a long-standing criticism of terrorism as a construct, as others have argued, also, as well as here in the UK. Max Hill, I think, has famously argued this as well. Yes. He was an independent terrorism reviewer, that criminal law is sufficient for crimes, right? So terrorism brings in a different sense of logic of whose violence is politically motivated.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if we don't have to engage in conversations like, or not, we don't have to like analyze this or unpack it. I think most people listening can understand that something about terrorism has to do with this relationship between violence and politics and some sort of political ambition. Okay. And one of the major critiques of it is actually really quite simple, that if you think about racism, racist attacks, I mean, every racist attack technically, by definition, is ideologically motivated.
Yep.
And is violent.
Absolutely.
Right? I was attacked when I lived in Germany and grew up in Berlin. I was attacked on the street. And the person was attacking me and he was spitting at me and he was saying, "Du bist Dreck." He was saying, like, you're dirt. Get out of my country, you're dirt. Right? So the ideology is clear. One that we can also chart its history. Where is that coming from? It's not some random event. Yeah. And it's violent, right? I think today they might call that lone wolf, but the problem is here is that regressively they might then, every attack then suddenly becomes a terrorism attack, right? What we know in that distinction between, white people have like a mental health issue. You said non-Muslims, it's actually white people, because I think we can make the argument that for other racialized minorities, it's also often not seen as mental health. But for people who are racialized as white, it's seen as a mental health issue, I think is just recognizable from the very problem with the idea of terrorism, is that it's inherently racist from its outset as an idea. Whose violence is considered political is one that privileges a white person immediately. Their violence is immediately always privileged as non-political. And there's a lot of ways we can explain that, right? The only times it becomes very explicitly associated with politics or political motivations is often when they're also very explicit about it. Yeah. Right? They come
out shouting and screaming political slogans.
Yeah, or they shout Britain first.
For instance.
Yes, I mean, that's the example that we know. Or they have a neo-Nazi tattoo. Yeah. I mean, the symbol is beyond the shadow of a doubt, right? For Muslims, I've heard, I think a counter-extremism expert once say that it's sufficient for a Muslim to even just say Allahu Akbar, right? To consider the political motivation behind attack, or if they're at all religious. From anyone I know who's gone through the criminal justice system for terrorism charges, they're always questioned incessantly about their faith, right? Incessantly. Schedule 7 arrests, incessantly questioned about faith. What do you believe? Which mosque do you go to? So I think that's my point that often I also, when I'm asked, this isn't a discussion, but I think I can make this point on the side. That people often ask me, okay, Tarek, isn't it important for us to push for more counterterrorism than towards the far right? Aren't they a threat to Muslims? And my answer is always unequivocally no. Yeah. Unequivocally. Because my point has never been that a person who's white isn't referred to prevent, or a person who's white isn't caught through counterterrorism. My point is that their bodies alone, they themselves alone, will always be privileged in that system, always. Whereas a racialized Muslim, with all these complicated signifiers, if they're not racialized as white, if they're practicing, whatever it might be, all gets encapsulated within this risk assessment. And I think it's something whereby it would only cause further damage and further issues in the Muslim community. So white people are privileged by their bodies alone in counterterrorism. To bring it then to why mental health isn't a solution. So I just want to mention that I think I recognize where that's coming from. I mentioned this word before, benevolence. Mental health has this air of benevolence. It has this air of, kind of like helping and safeguarding. And we can, instead of securitizing people and let's say locking them up in prisons, that's as one person associated with police said, isn't it better that they all just get mental health support, right? Which is kind of your argument as well, by saying, well, any and all violence has some sort of origins associated with mental health.
Yeah.
Now, first of all, I don't think I can agree with that on different levels. I think, first of all, as one, there's someone I know who used to run a youth center, and I used to work with her many years ago. And she made a really important point that every point of violence, every act of violence is a form of expression. Mm. And we need to understand, what is that expression, right? What is it trying to communicate as a form of language? Even if we completely disagree with it, we're putting away the criminal justice element to it, or whatever. Violence is a form of expression. What mental health ends up doing is that it ends up making a question of a person's psychological and emotional configuration, rather than what is this person actually trying to express. Okay. Even if, let's say, they were depressed, or even if they were anxious, or even, let's say, they were really unwell and they were disassociating, whatever it might be, it's important to understand that fundamentally. Mm. And we don't do that for very, very understood reasons historically.
Yeah, I'm assuming, the good lady, I'm sure she's never flouted that idea to the authorities of Prevent, for instance, or the Home Secretary.
Ironically, we were sitting with, so it was me and her and a few others, and we were sitting with police.
Right.
So she was saying that to the police, actually. She was making that point. She knew that the police wouldn't understand it. Right. Because ultimately, our institutions, especially as we have them now, developed with a history of management, right? So it was more about managing and controlling. One, I don't want to get academic, but I find this term really appropriate. There's a sociologist by Nicholas Rose. He calls it the anti-citizen, right? Like a lot of psychology developed as a way of managing anti-citizens. Those who are antisocial, those who...
The black sheep.
Yes, exactly, the black sheep. And I think it was never really a question of, okay, well, how do we understand the source of violence? It was more about how do we manage and contain it.
Right. It's like a senior police officer once said, as we were discussing, something not too far away, but not with any kind of knowledge of the aspects that you're talking of. But he simply said, listen, we're not here to ask why. We are here to basically stop these people and punish them if they do anything wrong. Yeah. That's essentially what our job is. So
that's it in a nutshell. And I've had people admit that to me as well. Ultimately, that's what these risk-based systems, that's how they develop. Policing, a lot of them are all about managing in some way, shape, or form. And they also draw upon psychiatry and other institutions to be able to manage as well, right? So they might not be able to, let's say, put someone in a prison, but they'll take them to a psychiatric ward for an evaluation to be able to section them, right? And it becomes a different way of managing them. Absolutely. Without understanding what the source of that person's being unwell at that moment is. And so I think...
And how does someone in that circumstance, how do they prove that they're not ill?
There's some really famous studies being done of I think there was a heyday of critical psychologists and psychiatrists, I would think about in the 60s or 70s. And one psychiatrist, I don't know if he was a psychiatrist, but it was an academic or a scholar, he brought himself to a psychiatric ward and he feigned illness to be, to be put into the psychiatric ward. To be admitted. And then he started acting completely normal. And by acting normal as in going back to not feigning anything anymore. But the staff never saw him or treated him any differently. So they felt like, well, that's all part of his illness, really, right? So, I mean, there's long histories of how I think diagnosis tends to follow us. We identify with it. So there's a lot of movements here in trying to understand and unpack how I guess personally significant, but also politically significant a mental health diagnosis can be. But I think what we need is not one in which we rely on these institutions.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that people who are unwell shouldn't be able to find and seek support.
Yeah.
I think actually the inverse. So if I may say, we're launching a project called Coming Home. And by we, I mean, it's an organization called Maslaha and another one called Lantern Initiative. And Coming Home is a project to provide a safe and secure space for anyone who experienced the violence of the criminal justice system or policing or prisons among Muslims, to be able to find a safe and secure space to find someone to speak with, a therapist. So we want to be able to help Muslims who've been wrongly impacted or negatively impacted by these systems. I mean, and prisons alone are notoriously Islamophobic. I mean, there's a lot of blind spots we have in the community of these very acute, very concentrated areas of Islamophobia. I mean, many Muslims in prisons often admit that they self-censored, they're managed in terms of being able to practice their faith. I know terrible stories for me as a psychologist. I work exclusively with Muslims who've experienced state violence in some shape or form. And the stories are atrocious. But what's incredible, I think, is that what we haven't come to appreciate is we can't just tell them, oh, well, you just need mental health support. Go to the NHS. And we need to make the NHS more sensitive to Muslims and more sensitive to like Muslim majority cultures. And that's the tendency. It's a neoliberal tendency. I'm not going to unpack that word, but it's a neoliberal tendency of just almost adding color to everything, right? Yes. But it's also an apolitical, a depoliticized approach, because why is it that these Muslims who experience these issues with police or security or prisons, why are they not going to the NHS? Because the fundamental element of trust is not there. They don't trust these institutions. And because we as Muslims haven't recognized that, we're not providing actual safe spaces for them to be able to find someone and be like, look, you can come to me. And I won't ever make a prevent referral to you, you know, and this is a sort of support that's really inherently community-based and inshallah, you know, one that I pray is, I guess, you know, I guess in line with what their hearts are experiencing. And I think thinking just like, oh, we need more psychologists and psychiatrists. I mean, if they're all depoliticized in their thinking, then no one will be able to see these people, one, and two, they won't be able to help them because they won't recognize, well, what's going on? Why is it? And I've had Muslim clients who told me that they've come to have terrible experiences with other Muslim mental health professionals. So, I mean, how do we complicate that relationship, right? We're not complicating that relationship. We certainly should be complicating it, because just because you're Muslim doesn't necessarily mean you can't either enact or reenact different forms of violence towards other Muslims.
So are new graduates of psychology, Muslims particularly, are they aware of this? Are they, do they understand what needs to happen so that they can better perform when dealing with people with issues within the Muslim community? I mean, is that that kind of awareness? Is it growing anyway, or is it encouraged?
Yeah.
Or is it not? I mean, it's fascinating that what you speak about, the depoliticization of psychology, that's something that's quite powerful. But are people, graduates academically and professionally, are they able to identify this as a problem and then go about exerting this understanding in a way that is positive?
Yeah. I think that's a really good question. I think it's twofold depending on if they're working publicly or privately. I think publicly we have to also affirm that when we think about, let's say, an issue with prevent policy, there's also hostile environment. There's other policies that are explicitly racist. It doesn't belong to individuals. It's within the institutions. So it's a pressure that comes upon them from the outside. And in my research on prevent, I recognize that most Muslim mental health professionals recognize the issues with prevent. Intuitively, they recognized it. I mean, they felt it in prevent training, etc. But they simply they themselves are depoliticized. So their ability to contest it or to show dissent in any way, shape, or form is itself securitized. I have an example that I've written about a psychiatrist trainee, a Muslim woman, a sister. She questioned why they're being trained in prevent. And the prevent trainer actually raised a complaint about her to management, and that went all the way up. And
the mere fact that she questioned
just
why it's
merely for questioning, and she wasn't the only one questioning it as well. And I think it speaks volumes to how we again assume that maybe NHS is like this apolitical space. It's not, right? And schools, same thing with the Palestine, everything. There's sometimes very explicit, but often very subtle moral boundaries of what's right and wrong, what you're allowed to say, what you're not allowed to say. And I think for many Muslims, in my experience, either they resist it in like minute ways, sort of micro resistance. But it seems to me often something like prevent is their first exposure to this, of understanding that, there's politics sort of in these settings, and they're almost exclusive examples of like Islamophobia, but maybe the disciplines themselves have no history. Certainly if they just sit down and read histories of books, especially in the coming from the United States and the Black community and how it was managed through the side disciplines, but also coming from elsewhere. If we look to Global South, in Palestine, a very famous psychiatrist there, Dr. Samah Jabir, she talks about how, she's a psychiatrist, but she talks about how the word trauma is not at all appropriate in Palestine. Because even the word, and I talk about this a little bit in my book, the word trauma, the very idea of trauma has what I call a temporal dimension. So it has something about time embedded within it. When I say the word trauma, and I would say I'm traumatized or you're traumatized, we're saying that something happened in the past, but now I'm carrying the repercussions of that event in the past, you see? So when we're talking about someone's being traumatized through the Quebec City mosque shooting, through Christchurch, we're talking about something that's occurred in the past, right? And that's where trauma, that the way it plays with time there's a political element there. It's very important that Dr. Jabir is referring to, because she's saying we're living in an existing state of suffocation, right? We're living in an existing state of oppression, right? So if you were being...
It's not something that happened.
It's not something that's happening. It's something that's continuously existing. So trauma, so she's saying that the only reason that she would use trauma is to make the violence that's occurring to them understandable and palpable to a Western audience.
And maybe because that's the only word that's available to describe the situation.
Well, I mean, I think some others might disagree. Like there's people like Frantz Fanon, a famous Martinique psychiatrist who went to North Africa to fight the French Imperial Army in the 60s. And, I think he certainly found ways of expressing this violence in a way that didn't necessarily have to use trauma. And he spoke about very real existing forms of oppression. And we have this vernacular. I mean, we have the words. Anyone can point out that if someone is beating another person, if I see a man actively beating a child, I'm not immediately thinking, oh,
what's the word for
this child is being, what's the word for this? Or the trauma, we're not thinking about trauma. We're immediately thinking about resolving this existing and very real violence that's occurring. So trauma has that problem. And I have that problem also with some of the experiences and some of the therapy or clients I've had here, where I feel that trauma certainly, they've been told they're traumatized, but their experience speaks to a constant and very existing fear that they might be taken back to prison. Not only here, we know these type of experiences in Egypt and other places. So if there's an existing fear of threat, then the word is actual threat, right? Yeah. It's not, the trauma makes it about something that person's internalized, rather than, oh, we have an actual threat that we have to understand and look at and be able to address collectively.
I mean, part of what you spoke about is something that we must come back to discuss at length, because it's absolutely fascinating, and that is what today we call, very flippantly, social engineering. Whether it's Big Brother, whether it's reality shows, whether it's TV dramas developed in a way that has a real impact and shows the kind of applications of these sciences for the pleasure of the masses.
Yeah.
The likes of crowd control, for instance, how you bring about a crowd either to revolt or to be subdued and to be under control. I mean, because that is definitely, when you look beyond the individual, that is definitely the next level of the application itself. And this, it really is quite scary. I mean, once you start thinking on that particular level, we're not talking about guns anymore. We're not talking about, tear gas. We're talking about a real internalization of that threat, so that person or those groups, they behave in a particular way in response to the kind of elements and factors that they're facing.
Yeah.
How do you see this developing? I mean, let's ask a question about the future a little bit. We know what the impact has been over the past, particularly 20 years, when we've had the war on terror. We have been exposed and learnt about the dozens, if not hundreds, of stories from children ranging from the age of 5 all the way to adulthood, schools, hospitals, playing fields. We've read all the stories. We've met many of those people. But where are we heading?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think there's different trajectories, obviously. I can chart 2 of them. I think one, if we look at prevent as an example again, I don't mean to focus on prevent. I think Islamophobia is obviously way broader than prevent. But to just take it as an example, in 2015, when prevent essentially tried to become a little bit more colorblind, tried to refocus itself a little bit more broadly on all communities, and the prevent training became colorblind, so it didn't talk about Muslims anymore. One of the ways it did that was through mental health. So thinking about emotional vulnerability, telling teachers, look at who among your students are emotionally vulnerable. Again, it's highly racialized still, because the subject is still terrorism. So who are they going to end up looking at, right? Like, I think that's the point. But what I'm trying to say here is that this effort to colorblind never actually addresses the inherent racism behind the strategy.
Yeah.
And to speak to the trajectory, Shawcross and his review of prevent is precisely what many of us have said and predicted was going to happen. There's always, in colorblind strategies, there's always this development whereby people are going to come up and say, why can't we just call it as it is, right? Let's stop making it about, climate change activists and animal rights activists and all that. No. Let's call a spade, right? And what was inherently with the problem with colorblindness is now, again, this counter-reaction whereby Islam and Muslims are now being much more explicitly targeted in political discourse. And the counterterrorism strategy that was just released a few days ago, I think last week, I didn't read through everything, but I tried to read through some of it. And lo and behold, one of the things that they're going to be implementing that they actually mention through prevent strategy is something called ideology training, right? Like it's embedded within the prevent, right? So this idea of really being able to focus on Islam now and Muslims. So that speaks to the trajectory is that things are actually looking much worse. And in a way, any Muslim who perhaps bought into, let's say prevent, or colorblinding prevent and making it about the far right, let's push prevent, let's push for more prevent, but making more prevent being more about the far right as well, we're kind of like, the chickens are coming home to roost, right? Like this is where we're seeing that inevitably the seed of the strategy had a very particular focus. The very constructs of it, terrorism, radicalization, extremism, are highly racialized. And we're seeing the fruit of that now. Yeah. It's gonna come back. We're gonna see a wider, with this at least, we're seeing wider commonalities and parallels with France and the hyper-management of Muslim civil society, of public thought, public behaviors. We're seeing much more of that. And I think that's one of the trajectories. I think at the same time, we're seeing a wider push for mental health. Just in general, there's this idea of, through austerity, there's been a lot of cuts to public funding. But mental health has been widely integrated as a way of bandaging rising, inflation, poverty. They want psychologists in all the schools. And children, we know in research, are increasingly depressed, anxious, many of them coming hungry to schools, right? And we see how mental health can come as a way of almost salvaging the happiness of these children without really addressing the key concerns. And I've made that point with regards to after the trauma response teams to Christchurch, to Grenfell. Grenfell had one of the largest trauma response, mental health trauma responses in European history. I think over 1,000, 2,000 people were seen, I'm forgetting the exact number, were seen for trauma. But did anybody in Grenfell experience any justice from it, right? So mental health, they might have been given therapy, right? But were they given justice, right? Were the were the physical conditions which allowed Grenfell to happen, have they been addressed? We know they haven't. So I think there's all these different trajectories, right? And I think some of them also have some tensions among themselves. I don't know exactly how well. I try to contain my pessimism. I think, inshallah, that we pray for better futures and we always keep up the hope. But we have to take with the causes as well. Yeah.
Fantastic. Jazakallah khair. Thank you very much.